All right, what's going on, guys? Dan Watson. Hope you guys are doing amazing. This is an interesting one. So Canon has just done a development announcement on the EOS R3, which if you're like me is probably not the camera that you thought they were going to do. I found out about this camera. They briefed me on it about a week ago, and I spent that last week going over all of these specs, really trying to figure out exactly what Canon was going to be doing with this camera. So here's everything that we know about the camera and my thoughts about where Canon is going with the EOS R3. Now, Canon has also released 3 new lenses today. So we have a 100mm f2.8 macro, which does have some really cool features, and then a new 400mm and a 600mm lens. And new on those comes with some huge asterisks because they're really not new lenses. They are basically the recycled EF mounts with a built-in adapter in them. You are going to get a few slight advantages, like a couple ounces of weight savings and stuff like that from going with the adapter built in. But honestly, I still think that I would pick up an EF version of any of these lenses and use the adapter because so many of us have 1DXs still, or borrow them, or agencies still have these lying around. So having the EF version and having it flexible to work with both RF or EF is better to me than having an RF version only, especially until we have replaced these cameras with RF versions, which might be coming sooner because of the EOS R3. All right, so probably the biggest new characteristic of this is going to be that it is in between the Canon 1DX Mark III and an EOS R5. So this is a new series of camera according to Canon, and that tells us a lot about this camera. So let's kind of dissect it a little bit. So Canon has actually stated that the dust and moisture resistance is going to be on the same level as this camera right here. Also, it's going to have an integrated battery grip, so very similar build-wise. It does look a little bit smaller if you look at it. It doesn't have, well, obviously it doesn't have this giant viewfinder in it. It's going to be a mirrorless camera, so it's basically a small TV screen, so you don't have all of those optical properties built into this. So it's going to be a little bit shorter on this, kind of like these R5 cameras on here. So you're probably going to get some weight savings and a little bit of size savings, but it's going to be a very similar design to this right here. Now, the two things that I noticed on this is that the design might be a little bit similar, but we have some different button layouts. You can kind of see some differences on this side right here and also on the right side of the camera. So both of them are going to be slightly different. So I do think that they're probably going to incorporate maybe like an R5 smaller screen with a lot of the buttons kind of backed off a little bit below the shutter, rather than having this lineup of buttons right here and this huge line of buttons right here. So they're probably going to change a few things on the design itself. So the fact that this is basically going to be a 1DX style body, that might be a huge, awesome thing for you, or it might be kind of a negative depending on how you use your cameras. This is probably the most comfortable camera that I have ever held. It just weighs a ton, but having the ability of going smaller and then adding a grip if you want to get something larger, there's a lot to be said for having that ability. So all of that is kind of interesting though, because if this is a new class of camera, but it looks like a 1DX, what the crap is actually the difference defining this camera? Now, a lot of this is probably going to depend on the sensor, because the sensor itself is something new for Canon. We have a full frame back illuminated stacked CMOS sensor. And where we first saw stacked CMOS sensors was with the Sony A9. And what this has meant largely, especially for those Sony cameras, is that we can now basically have crazy fast readouts from the sensor itself. So you really don't even need a physical hardware shutter because the image is read straight off the sensor itself. Now, we've seen this before in video. This is how video works. It reads the image straight from the sensor. But if the readout speeds are not fast enough, you will suffer from flicker and distortion and rolling shutter and all kinds of issues. So these stacked CMOS sensors are used to get that high speed readout so that you don't actually have to shoot with the shutter mechanism itself. Now, being able to shoot without a hardware shutter has a lot of advantages to it. So you can be fully silent. Having silent shutter is awesome for things like weddings or press conferences or a lot of things, even wildlife and things like that would be highly awesome for being able to have a silent shutter. You get faster shooting speeds because you don't have to wait on this physical mirror to move out of the place like a DSLR, and then you don't have to wait for the shutter mechanism to actually open and close. There's no wear and tear on the shutter itself. So if you're shooting tens of thousands of images, no worry about shutter wear. And no blackout, so you don't have to worry about that black frame that comes in every time the shutter crosses the sensor and blacks everything out. That's now gone, so you can just shoot continuously, which is really awesome. So this is potentially a really big deal, something that Sony's capitalized on, and I'm really happy that Canon is entering it. Canon claims it can do 30 frames per second with AF tracking and auto exposure in eShutter, which is electronic shutter. The big question is going to be the read speeds from this sensor. It needs to be crazy fast. Basically, the enemy of eShutter is going to be indoors or night shooting with artificial lighting or high-speed environments, which if you're looking at any sports wildlife action camera, that's basically the worst case scenario right there. You're shooting football games in artificial lighting, you're shooting indoor sports, you're shooting high-speed motion with animals and wildlife and stuff like that. So birds, anything like that. So there are a huge disadvantages if Canon cannot pull off this extreme fast readout speeds right here. The other question is going to be resolution. We don't know the resolution of this yet. Most of the time, in order to get these crazy fast readout speeds, cameras have to go with lower resolution. The exception to that was Sony's A1, which managed to pull off 30 frames per second at 50 megapixels. So let's see here if Canon tries to beat Sony. For me, anything, if they kind of go above 30 megapixels, that's going to be high enough resolution to pretty much satisfy everyone. I don't think Canon has to pull off 51 megapixels to make this camera work. However, I think Canon could kind of shoot for the skies and try and beat it. One thing that Canon has that Sony doesn't is the ability to shoot medium and small RAW. So basically, if you have a 70 megapixel camera right here, Canon will give us the option of a 30 megapixel or a 15 megapixel RAW, something like that. So you'll probably have all of those options as well. Now, one ace that Canon has up its sleeve is that it uses CFexpress Type B in most of its new cameras, like the R5 and 1DX. Those cards are actually capable of incredibly fast write speeds and read speeds. The Sony A1, for example, uses CFexpress Type A. These cards, the CFexpress Type B, are capable of twice as fast read and write speeds, even more than that. And so potentially here, Canon could be clearing the buffer of even higher resolution files way faster than even something like the Sony A1, which has blown me away so far. So this is something really cool that Canon could push if they wanted to, being able to have those super fast readout speeds and having these crazy fast cards could be exactly the recipe we needed for something awesome. Now, autofocus is another area that Canon says they're improving with this. Already, Canon has probably one of my favorite autofocus systems on the market. I think they kind of trade blows with Sony depending on what you're shooting, which one performs best. I kind of prefer the way the Sony locks on the eye, but the performance on the Canon is still amazing. Now, one thing that the R3 claims to be better at is going to be having some deep learning algorithms on here and new subject recognition. So we'll have to see what that is with better, I don't know, birds or other animals or something like that. Probably the most disappointing thing to me about Canon's autofocus system is not the cameras, it's actually their lenses. A lot of lenses have not been upgraded with fast enough autofocus systems to really compete with it. I'm curious if a new 400 and 600 millimeter lenses will still be able to pull off 30 frames per second with an object running towards you or moving towards you at crazy fast speeds using the same technology that we've been using on DSLRs. That's going to be really interesting to see. Another question I have is how fast that AF system is going to be able to work. So for example, Sony touts the ability to have 120 calculations on their autofocus system on the A1 every second. And so that means for every image you're taking, there are 4 frames where it is analyzing the autofocus before the next frame, or 3 frames before the next frame is actually taken. So we don't know how fast this autofocus performance is going to be and whether it can keep up with moving objects while shooting 30 frames per second. So this is something else that we're going to really be curious about, and then the performance with a lot of existing Canon lenses. So one thing that's interesting is Canon did not mention video at all. I do think this camera will have video and they'll do some announcements eventually, but for now, absolutely nothing. Also, we don't know if it'll have a new processor. So if it's using something like the R5 processor, that probably gives us a little insight into what video specs we could possibly see from this. Now, depending on whether Canon goes high resolution or not, will depend on a lot for video. If they go high resolution, you probably will see 8K recording. You might not see some of these larger frame rates like 4K 120 or 1080p at 240 or anything like that, because the camera just can't handle all of those pixels. If they go with something around that 45 to 50 megapixels, it'll probably be very similar to the R5. If they go lower resolution for this, you probably won't see 8K because it needs 45 megapixels to do that, but you could see even faster frame rates or better handling of those faster frame rates. Now, one thing these larger bodies do is better heat management. So I think we're probably going to get away with some of the overheating that the R5 has had. I think it will be a bit improved in the new R3. Now, Canon also didn't mention price at all. However, they have told us that this camera is kind of stacked between the R5 and the 1DX Mark III. So hopefully that means the price is as well, and they kind of price this thing between the 4,000, 5,000 range. I think that will be absolutely awesome. I've always thought that the A1 from Sony has been overpriced. I really think that it was an A9 III, and then Sony just realized the camera was so awesome and competing so well with cameras like this that we could basically price it at this and we would be absolutely fine with it. So potentially this is a camera, the new R3 is a camera that can call Sony's bluff on this and deliver the performance that the A1 does for a price that is less than a 1DX and kind of more floating in the A9, what the A9 III would have been price market, which is at $4,000 to $5,000. This is potentially a huge chance for Canon to deliver something awesome in that price range. The other option that Canon could take is to keep this low resolution and kind of go after what the A9 III would have been, stay in that 24 megapixel range, maybe bump things up to 30, deliver some solid video specs, and then price it something similar. So it won't have all of the features and resolution of something like an A1, but it also won't be priced in that range. And it will kind of be what the A9 III could be if they actually made one. So this is another alternative that Canon has. So there's a lot of different options on here where Canon could take this that we don't quite know yet. The other big question here is, what does this actually mean for the 1DX series? I mean, Canon directly says that this is not a 1DX or a Canon R5. This is a new class, but let's be honest, I think that this camera is going to blow away the 1DX in every area. I can't think of one area where the 1DX will be better. Now, my first guess is that maybe this is different because of just having a stacked CMOS sensor on here. So this will be the camera range that focuses on that, and the 1DX series will focus on your traditional style sensors on this. However, I can't see a huge advantage to Canon doing it that way. Stacked CMOS sensors are not less expensive from anything I know about sensor creation, so I don't know why they would do that in a lesser camera, and there's no real downsides to them at this moment. So my guess is that this might be more of a resolution thing. So maybe Canon takes this camera up to higher resolutions like the A1 did and go 50 megapixels or more, and Canon keeps the 1DX line as the faster camera with lower resolution. Although still, in the meantime, until we have a new 1DX, this will probably beat that camera. So my guess is that we're still about 3 to 6 months away from an official announcement with all of the specs on the new R3. There might be some trickling of specs that come out in the next few weeks or months, so definitely stay tuned. Subscribe if you haven't already. Please like this video, guys. If you haven't checked out the full reviews, definitely do that. But I'm really curious what you guys think of this camera. Let me know in the comments below. Are you getting excited about this, or maybe it's just too little information for you to get stoked right now? This is a lot to unpack, so I'm really curious your thoughts and on those new asterisk lenses that just came out today. So hope you guys are doing amazing. I'll see you soon in a new video.